In the heart of the Arkansas cotton belt, where the land was rich and the souls of men were often poor, lay the Whitmore plantation. It was a kingdom built not on honor or nobility, but on a foundation of laughter, liquor, and a casual, almost cheerful cruelty. The master of this domain was Charles Whitmore, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance. And on one sweltering summer night, in a parlor thick with the smoke of cigars and self-satisfaction, he would make a bet that would not only seal his wife's fate, but would ignite a fire that would one day Margaret was a woman of formidable size, but her heart was even larger. Her kindness, however, was a currency with no value at her husband's table. To Charles, her size was not a feature, but a flaw, a source of private shame, and, tonight, of public amusement. He had married her for her father's land, and now that he had it, he treated her as another one of his oversized, slightly disappointing possessions. I tell you, gentlemen, I own the largest tracts of land, the finest horses, and the fattest wife in all of Arkansas. She is a monument to my prosperity, is she not? A wave of cruel, appreciative laughter ripples through the room. Margaret flinches, her knuckles white as she grips her napkin. But the true spectacle of the Whitmore household was not Margaret. It was Elias.
Elias was the plantation's jester, a living curiosity for Charles to trot out for his guests. He was mocked by the overseers, teased by the other house slaves, who saw him as an anomaly, a broken thing. But behind the mask of subservience was a mind as sharp as any in that room. He saw everything, heard everything, and endured it all with a silence that the drunken planters mistook for simplicity. A planter named Beau, his face slick with sweat, leaned forward, goading Charles. "A monument she may be, Charles," he sneered, "but a useless one. I wager you couldn't give her away, let alone sell her." Charles's eyes glittered with drunken pride. "I could sell anything I own," he roared. "My word is law on this land. I could sell my fat, useless wife to anyone, and I guarantee she'd never be missed." The challenge hung in the air. Beau laughed, a nasty, wheezing sound. "Oh, I don't doubt you could try, but I wager even your dwarf slave wouldn't want her." The room erupted. The insult was perfect in its cruelty. A single arrow. Elias moved from the shadows into the center of the room. The laughter died down to a hungry, expectant silence. All eyes were on him. "Elias, I have an offer for you. I will sell you my wife, Margaret, your new mistress, for the price of this." The room exploded in a roar of laughter, so loud it shook the crystal goblets. It was the perfect joke, the ultimate humiliation, a masterpiece of casual cruelty. Margaret stared down the length of the table, her face ashen, her mind refusing to comprehend what was happening. This was not real. It was a nightmare. Elias did not laugh. He did not smile. He simply looked down at the coin, then up at Charles,
And finally, his gaze settled on Margaret. In his eyes, for a fleeting—
"It is done," Charles bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. "Take your property, Elias." Margaret didn't even scream, as her own husband and his friend Beau grabbed her by the arms and dragged her from her chair. Her disbelief had given way to a silent, catatonic horror. She was pulled from the dining room, through the grand hall, and out onto the dark porch, the sound of the men's laughter following her like a pack of wolves. They shoved her down the steps and into the dirt of the courtyard. "Your place is in the quarters now, with your new master." He turned and walked back inside, the door to the big house closing with a sound like a vault being sealed. Margaret was left alone in the darkness, her fine silk dress soiled, her world utterly destroyed. A moment later, Elias emerged from the house, not looking at her, and began the long walk toward the slave quarters. He did not command her to follow. He did not have to. She had nowhere else to go. That night, the whispers on the plantation were not about cotton prices or the weather. They were about the unthinkable. The woman who had been the mistress of the house, the symbol of the Whitmore name, was now property. And her owner was the man everyone, black and white, had considered to be the lowest of them all. The planters thought they had witnessed the end of a woman's pride. They had no idea they had just witnessed the birth of a legend. Dawn in the slave quarters of the Whitmore plantation was always a harsh affair, a prelude to another day of back-breaking labor. But on this morning, the air was charged with something new. All eyes were on the fallen queen. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who had yesterday been the mistress of all she surveyed, was now an outcast, a piece of property traded for a silver coin. They expected tears. They expected hysterics. They expected the pathetic collapse of a woman who had never known a day of real hardship. But they, like her husband, had misjudged the depths of the woman they thought they knew. Her new master, Elias, did not treat her as property. He did not mock her or command her. In fact, he barely spoke to her at all. But his actions spoke a language Margaret hadn't heard in years, the language of basic human decency. He offered her water. He offered her a portion of his own meager food. And as the day wore on, while the other slaves were sent to the fields, he began to build. With a quiet, relentless determination, he constructed a small, crude but solid hut for her at the edge of the quarters, a space for her to have a shred of privacy, a sliver of dignity. He treated her not as a prize to be lorded over, but as a fellow soul trapped in a world of cruelty. For the first time in a decade, a man was not looking at her with contempt or indifference, but with a quiet, profound respect. This kindness was a lifeline, and it slowly began to pull Margaret back from the abyss of her despair. The first few weeks were a blur. The change did not go unnoticed. The initial mockery and suspicion in the quarters began to curdle into a grudging respect. They saw that she did not demand special treatment. She took her small portion of food and often shared it with the children. She had a gentle touch with the sick, remembering old herbal remedies her grandmother had taught her. Most importantly, she listened. She sat with the women as they mended clothes and listened to their stories of lost children, of brutal punishments, of the small, defiant joys they carved out of their oppressive lives. For the first time, she was not hearing about slavery. She was seeing the faces of the enslaved. Her own humiliation had opened a door in her heart. allowing the pain of others to finally enter. Slowly, imperceptibly, the social order of the quarters began to realign itself around her. When there was a dispute, the slaves found themselves turning not to the overseer, but to Mistress Margaret. She judged with a fairness and compassion the plantation had never known. When a new mother was too weak to work, Margaret would organize the other women to cover her duties, a quiet, effective act of collective bargaining. She was not their mistress. She was not their owner. She was becoming their heart. They gave her a new name, whispered in the fields and by the fires at night, the Queen of the Quarters. Meanwhile, in the big house, Charles Whitmore's kingdom was beginning to crumble. The cruel joke that had brought him such amusement had backfired spectacularly. The plantation, once a well-oiled machine of fear and forced labor, began to seize up. Without Margaret's quiet, efficient management of the household and its supplies, the big house fell into disarray. But the real rot was in the fields. The slaves, now bound by a secret loyalty to their queen, engaged in a campaign of silent, infuriating sabotage. Tools would break, fences would fall. The pace of the cotton picking slowed to a crawl. The laughter that had once echoed in Charles's halls was gone, replaced by a tense, resentful silence. All he heard now were the whispers, carried on the wind from the quarters, stories of the wife he had thrown away. He became obsessed with the rumors of the fat woman who became the queen of the quarters. He would watch from his porch, a spy in his own kingdom, as his former wife moved through the quarters with a grace and authority she had never possessed in his house. He saw the way the other slaves deferred to her, the way their children ran to her, the way Elias stood by her side, not as a master, but a loyal, devoted guard. He had intended to humiliate her, to break her. Instead, he had set her free. A house built on cruelty cannot stand forever. As the months turned into a year, Charles Whitmore's world continued its slow, inexorable collapse. His crops had failed, his debts had mounted, and his authority had become a joke. He was a king with no subjects, a master with no control. He locked himself away in the big house, his only companions the ghosts of his own pride and the bourbon that burned away his days and nights. He had lost everything, but his reckoning, the final payment for his sins, was yet to come. It came on a tempestuous night in late autumn, when a bolt of lightning, as if sent by Providence itself, struck the dry, aging roof of the manor. The fire spread with an unholy speed, consuming the symbols of Charles's wealth, the fine furniture, the velvet curtains, the portraits of his ancestors. It was a funeral pyre for a dying dynasty. Trapped on the second-floor balcony, surrounded by a wall of flames, was Charles himself. Drunk, terrified, and utterly alone. The man who had once been the master of hundreds was now a helpless prisoner in his own burning monument. He screamed for help, his voice a pathetic, desperate cry, swallowed by the roar of the fire. "Help me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with terror. "Someone, please help me!" But down below, the crowd of his enslaved workers stood still. They did not move. They did not whisper. They simply watched. Their silence a final, damning verdict. In that moment, looking up at the woman he had tried to destroy, Charles Whitmore finally understood the totality of his failure.
He had made a bet to humiliate her, to prove her worthlessness. But in doing so, he had stripped away her gilded cage and allowed the powerful, compassionate, and unbreakable woman within to be born. The fire that was consuming his house was nothing compared to the strength he saw burning in her eyes. The bet had destroyed him, not her. Charles died 3 days later, not from the fire, but from a sickness of the soul. The doctors called it lung fever from the smoke, but the slaves knew the truth. He died of a broken spirit, poisoned by the shame of his own monstrous actions. The reading of his will was a quiet affair, held in the town courthouse.
She sold off half the land to fund her new vision. With Elias by her side, not as a slave, but as a partner, she rebuilt the quarters. The crude, windowless slave huts were torn down. In their place, she built proper homes with gardens and porches. She established a school for the children and a community hall. The land that had once been a place of brutal labor became a haven, a place of shared work and shared profit for those who chose to stay and build a new life as free men and women. She was no longer Margaret Whitmore, the planter's wife, nor was she the fallen victim of a cruel bet. She had been forged in the fires of humiliation and had emerged not as a mistress, but as a leader. A true queen whose reign was built on compassion, whose crown was forged from the love and respect of her people. He sold her for a coin, but she bought back her soul, her people, and her name.